I'm Tisha Bader. Welcome to our series Durban Revisited on JBS in partnership with B'nai B'rith International, where we address the Durban Conference of 2001, the global conference on racism that shocked many Jewish attendees when instead it turned to the targeting of Israel and the Jewish people. And we address the connection of the Jewish people to the State of Israel and to Zionism. Here now is CEO of B'nai B'rith International, Dan Mariaschin, and guest Natan Sharansky.
Thank you, Tisha. Natan Sharansky is a human rights activist and author and former Soviet refusenik. He is currently the chairman of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, known as ISGAP, and is also a former chair of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel, and a former Israeli government minister. Natan Sharansky, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, as a former Soviet refusenik, later a political leader in Israel and chair of the executive of the Jewish Agency, not only the Jewish people but also the Jewish state has played a profoundly central part in your life. Can you tell our viewers what Israel and Zionism meant to you as a Jewish prisoner of conscience who was not allowed to leave the Soviet Union? And is the reality of Israel today different for you than the Israel of your imagination in the Soviet Union?
Well, look, I was a typical Soviet Jew, loyal Soviet Jew, what means that I grew without any identity and without freedom, meaning that we knew that we are Jewish because it is written in the idea of your parents, but there is nothing in our life Jewish, no tradition, no holidays, no language, no religion, no bar mitzvah, no brit milah. The only Jewish thing is antisemitism, a lot of antisemitism. And no freedom. And you know very well that you really cannot say publicly what you think or what you feel, and the truth you have to keep only for your family. And there are no values in your life except of the value of survival in spite of all the restrictions. And what means that you have to professional to succeed in physics or mathematics or whatever you're doing. And that's the way of Jewish survival. Our life changed because of Israel. After 1967, with this amazing victory of Israel and humiliation for the Soviet Union, suddenly everybody looks at you and says, how you guys did it? And you understand, for them, for people who love you, for people who hate you, all of them, you're connected to Israel. And then when you start studying in the underground about Israel, about Zionism, suddenly you discover that if you want, this will be your history, this will be your country, these will be your people, and it gives you tremendous strength to start fighting for your rights, for rights of other Jews, and for the rights of everybody. So the source of our energy, of our strength, of our determination to fight was coming from Israel, from Zionism, and from this feeling of solidarity with the Jewish people. And this feeling that Israel will not leave you alone, that they will come when the Israeli airplane will come and take you from prison, and the Jewish people don't stop their fight even for one day, that's what was giving me strength during these 9 years of prison. Now, when I came to Israel, of course, I came straight from hell to paradise. And even in paradise, you'll find out that it's not exactly the paradise of your dreams. I'm sure that every religious person, when he or she will come to Olam Haba, to the next world, there'll be some disappointments. And yes, there are disappointments, but with all these disappointments, all these struggles, and as a politician, I was involved in many struggles, and as a head of Jewish agency in many confrontations between Jews of diaspora and the Israeli government. With all this, you never forget the big picture, that what unites us, our desire to continue together, our march through history, Israel and Jews of the world, it's so much bigger than everything but this unites us, that, okay, we have problems, they have to be dealt, we have to correct, we have to improve, we have to repair, But the most important, we have to remember that all our strength to make this world better comes from one source, from our connection to our people, to the state of Israel and Zionism.
Well, thankfully, with the fall of the Soviet Union, Jews who were trapped behind the Iron Curtain were able to leave, and many chose to immigrate to Israel. The situation of a large part of the global Jewish community in that respect has improved since the 1970s and 1980s, yet there are still some Jewish communities living under authoritarianism and that kind of rule in different parts of the world. What relevance do you see Zionism as having for those Jews today, and how can we best alleviate their circumstances? And I might add also, how might Zionism as the national determination, self-determination movement of the Jewish people again be recognized as a movement that really is rooted in human rights?
Well, I would say that if we are only concerned about Jews who live under the totalitarian regimes, of course we have to be concerned. And of course we have to, as the head of Jewish agency, we spent a lot of time thinking about Jews in Iran and Jews in Venezuela and Jews in other problematic places of the world. But let's remember, majority of Jewish people today in diaspora live in the free world. And then in the free world, they have increasing problem of antisemitism, of intolerance, of hatred. And it is as important for Israel as to keep connection with Jews of the under totalitarian rule. It's no less important to strengthen connection between Israel and every Jew in the diaspora community. From my experience as the head of Jewish agency, and I was in the overwhelming majority of Jewish communities of the world, there are only two forces which keep us from assimilation. It's force of our tradition and force of Zionism. Connection to the state of Israel, it's not only physical connection for protecting you from authoritarian rule. Connection to the state of Israel, that's a very important part of Jewish identity of everybody. And whenever Jews are thinking about Tikkun Olam, and practically every young Jew, he's not Jew if he is not thinking about Tikkun Olam, how to make the world better. I always try to remind them that you will need a lot of strength to make the world better. And there is only one source of this strength, of this energy, your connection to the state of Israel and your connection to your people.
The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, known as IHRA, has an important working definition of anti-Semitism that has grown in use. It's being adopted now by countries and by city councils and states and football associations. Even before IHRA, though, you had a simple but important framework to understand whether anti-Israel animus manifested anti-Semitism, known as the 3 Ds: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. Can you analyze for us how the UN's treatment of Israel stacks up under the 3 Ds, and what role might the Durban Conference play in your analysis?
Well, there is direct connection between IHRA definition, between 3 Ds, and between first Durban Conference. And I'll explain why. Durban Conference was planned by United Nations as the first global conference to struggle against racism. And it was prepared, the preparations were taking few years. And though we were getting early warnings, I was in the first Netanyahu government then, and then I was in Barak's government when Durban took place. Though we did get early warnings that it is prepared as something, first of all, against Israel, we couldn't imagine. By the way, the first who was warning us that we have to take a stand was Professor Irvin Kotler from Canada. But nobody could imagine that the global international United Nations conference, the first conference on the problems of racism, at the time of awful international conflicts, of ethnic cleansing in Africa, in Asia, in many parts of the world, it will all be turned against Israel. And it was quite a shock. And when it happened, and it happened, in fact, with the support, or with the agreement of many political leaders in the free world, in the West. That was the difference between United Nations resolution of 1975, that Zionism is racism, when all the free world was against that resolution. And now, when in fact the chairman of the Durban conference was Representative of Ireland, and many Western countries were tolerant to this vicious anti-Israel rhetorics, that's when seeing the difficulty to explain to the world that that is anti-Semitism, I proposed my 3Ds, that demonization of Israel, delegitimization of Israel, and clear double standard, which is applied by United Nations to Israel, which is not applied to any country of the world. That is the same tools which were used by anti-Semites against Jews. Now they are used by international organizations and some individuals against the Jewish state. And I propose to see them as a criteria of the anti-Semitism. And well, there was a big debate, arguments, but in fact, if you look at the international definition, IRA definition, which was taken like 15 years after this, in fact, it adopted these 3Ds, this principle. But though now so many countries adopted it, we still have a problem that our opponents, and sometimes even our opponents in Jewish community, are insisting the double standard, it cannot be anti-Semitism, that boycott of Israel, chosen from all the other countries, it cannot be anti-Semitism. And I had a really ridiculous moment when in one day I received from the State Department the agreement between Bahrain leaders and America to fight against anti-Semitism based on international definition of IRA, including anti-Zionism. And at that day, some organization, Jewish organization in San Francisco, decides that we cannot accept this definition because it restricts the legitimate criticism. It's ridiculous. Everybody is for legitimate criticism of Israel as in any other democratic country. The Israeli politician who will stop criticizing Israel will have no political future in Israel. So it's not about criticism of Israel, it's about denial of the right of Zionism to exist as an ideology and Israel to exist as a Jewish state. And that is anti-Semitism of today.
Well, I would agree with you about those who are saying this is a freedom of speech issue. This is not really a freedom of speech issue, because what the IRA definition really confronts, and there are many parts to it, but what it really confronts is contemporary anti-Semitism, so much of which is centered on anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism. So your points on those who are trying to change the definition are extremely well taken. If I can move to a related matter, recently a poll of American Jews found a minority, but an alarmingly sizable one, that described Israel as an apartheid state, with an even more disturbing number of young American Jews believing this. Tying Israel to apartheid was one of the key goals of anti-Israel activists in Durban in South Africa, and it's clear that some inroads have been made in public opinion over all of these years on this when so many young American Jews purportedly believe this claim. Where have young diaspora Jews, do you think, been failed in education about Israel and Zionism? And what can be done to combat the demonization of the world's only Jewish state?
First of all, I think we didn't fight our enemies from the very first moment when they tried to present us as apartheid state, as a state of ethnic cleansing. And today they say that Zionism is white Jewish racism. I think we really didn't I can say we in the government 20 years ago, when all this rhetoric started, we didn't take it seriously. And I don't think that anybody in the Jewish world could really think that we can be presented as a apartheid state, because you really need to twist the definition of apartheid. And everybody who was acquainted with the situation in South Africa, I was many times in American university saying, let me, as the one who was international observer in South African election, as the one who was friend of Nelson Mandela, let me tell you about what apartheid means. It means when the state, the authority, is creating different laws for white and blacks. And let's compare it with this situation in Israel. The problem is that at some moment, our opponents are not interested in discussing it with us. They're discussing it only between themselves. And here, when it comes to young Jews, there is no other way but to bring these young Jews to Israel, to welcome them in Israel, and to give them first-hand experience. That's why birthrights was so important. That's why it's unfortunate now, because of the epidemic, it's weakened. But I have to say, and I hear from the knowledge, today many students, young students on the campuses, are afraid even to say publicly that they go on birthright trip, because it can change their environment, their attitude from the professors, from different organizations, from their friends on websites, in the internet. So really, I think it went too far, and we have to put a very clear red line. The fact that some Jews who are active inside Jewish communities, who call themselves rabbis or chazanim, and so signed letters in the last months calling Israel, not Israel, Zionism, as a white Jewish supremacy ideology, the ideology of genocide, ideology of ethnic cleansing. We must make it clear. We must put clear red lines. Their philosophy, their demand to see the world as without Zionism is the same demand as the demand of Iran to see the world without Zionism.
Well, but Jewish education is still so important. If young students arriving on university campuses at the age of 18 have not had proper grounding in Jewish history and in Zionism, State of Israel, it doesn't necessarily have to be a visit per se, but there has to be some kind of infusion of pride in what the State of Israel means to us. Then by the time they get to campus, with all of the currents that are sweeping through the campus, especially today, but for decades already, then we have certainly a more difficult challenge. I'm going to go back to the UN, if I can, Natan, for a moment. We often find that countries that are the most vociferous critics of Israel are those with horrific human rights records themselves. Why is the hatred of Israel, and often of Jews, and oftentimes it goes together, so intimately linked with authoritarianism around the world? On the other hand, how can persistent anti-Semitism be better understood in open, more advanced democracies?
Well, I'll tell you, growing in the Soviet Union, for me, it was so obvious that anti-Semitism is the weapon of totalitarian regime. The totalitarian regime, in order to control their own people, needs enemies, external and internal enemies, that he can mobilize people to fight them, and that he can direct the hatred of the oppressed people toward them. And Jews and Zionists were ideal enemies, internal and external enemies at the same time. And that was clear to everybody, to Jews and non-Jews, that there is no difference between anti-Zionist rhetorics of Soviet Union and anti-Semitic practice of Soviet Union. That there are the same campaigns, the same cartoons, the same images were in the attacks on Jews and attacks on Israel. So for me, it was and not for me, for practically for everybody in the Soviet Union was clear. First, that there is deep connection between anti-Semitism and Zionism. But second, I believed that anti-Semitism is the weapon of totalitarian regime, and there will be no place for anti-Semitism in the modern free world. That's why, for me, it was natural, and it is natural that totalitarian regimes and fundamentalist regimes and Arab regimes which don't want to accept our existence are using anti-Semitism as a natural tool. But the fact that so many people in the free world are ready to accept, or at least to tolerate this philosophy, and to refuse to see connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, that's very disappointing. And that's why we have to direct our efforts to show connection between violators of human rights and anti-Semites. Well, those who are fighting against Jewish state and those who are fighting against the freedom for their own people. And showing this connection, that should be our message also to the free world. You are for the rights of women? Okay, look, where in the Middle East the rights of women are protected. You are for the rights of LGBT, you are for the rights of all the races. Look, compare Israel record and all these countries and think how it happened that you are in the camp with these countries.
We went through this terrible situation in Durban. How do you understand, the short time we have left, how do you understand this lack of solidarity and lack of sympathy for Israel's struggle against terrorism during an era when the fight against terrorism became global on 9/11, just days after the Durban conference?
I asked once the head of the International Human Rights Committee, then it was some outstanding Canadian judge, and I said, how you can accept, and it was a few years after Durban, how can you accept that every year in your committee, Israel is condemned and there are special resolutions. At the same time, you're ignoring all the other awful conflicts and ethnic cleansings in the world, with Chechnya, with what's happening in Sudan, with what's happening in China and so on. And she told me, first of all, you're right. But secondly, she said, it doesn't depend on me. There is kind of understanding or agreement between Arab countries and the countries of China, that the question of China is not raised and the question of Arab countries. There is kind of agreement between Russia and its allies that Chechnya is not raised, and as a result, they are not raising the question of Sudan. And there is no such agreement on Israel. And then I said, you know what, even if it is logical, technical, it can be explained, doesn't it mean that the world can agree to be silent on all the human rights violations and apply a very different sentiment to Israel? Isn't it anti-Semitism? So I think what happened in Durban, first of all, I think it caught many Western countries by surprise. Also, they were tolerant to the criticism of Israel. They were not against this criticism of Israel. They somehow didn't notice how disbalanced it is. But then, after this, they found out that to bring this balance back will be problematic, because they have problem now with the Muslim minority in their own countries, and every question which they will raise, it can cause some diplomatic implications. And the one which is not difficult to support is attacks on Israel. No, I don't want to exaggerate. Look, America refused then to participate in that conference, and a number of Western countries after that conference warned that they will not take part in this process at all. So, in fact, we have a lot of allies, and we have potentially a lot of those who are ready to understand and to united with us in this struggle. But we have to work very hard to keep our truth and to defend it.
Natan Sharansky, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for your work, and keep fighting.
And thank you all for tuning in. Please stay tuned to our full Durban Revisited series on JBS. And for ways to get engaged, please visit b'nai or our social media channels. I'm Dan Mariaschin. Goodbye for now.